Ready? So this little speculation is going to do two things. First of all, it's going to subsume a kind of more standard tradition of continental philosophy under a certain version of truth, and then I will present an alternate version of truth. So my argument to begin with is that from, not just including these figures, but from, for example, Hegel through to Heidegger, and as well ending up with Badiou and Žižek, truth, the ontological status of truth, is on a certain level inseparable from or entangled with or functionally distorted by a certain occlusion or obfuscation of the same truth. This ontology of truth from Hegel through to Badiou through to Žižek, which is in various different ways complicit with either multiplicities or ontological negativities or epistemological inconsistencies that are ascribed to being. And this ontology of truth, the basic formulation of truth, is incompatible with our conscious everyday understanding. It's incompatible with the basic linguistic framework or basic conscious, self-conscious coordinates of our existing social worlds. In other words, truth is incompatible to the consciousness, to the world that reflects on truth. For these figures, truth is, in other words, at risk of being perpetually misidentified, of being faultily expressed. In a very straightforward way, which I argue encompasses everyone from Hegel through to Žižek, including non-Hegelian, non-Žižekian philosophers, whether it's Heidegger, whether it's Husserl. For all of them, the truth is always at risk of being misidentified. The completeness, the wholeness of truth is always precariously and indirectly placed in relation to the world, the consciousness, the linguistic framework that might reflect on this truth. So, in a very, very broad sweep, but a sweep that I justify, I would argue that this standard accepted mainstream tradition of continental philosophy can be summarized by the great theoretical, speculative realist Jack Nicholson, especially in the film A Few Good Men, where I'm sure most of you have watched it, where Tom Cruise says, "All I want is the truth," and Jack Nicholson replies, "You can't handle the truth." It's not just that we can't handle the truth because we're stubborn, we can't handle the truth because the ontological immanence of truth, the multiplicity, the negativity that truth implies, is functionally and constitutively incompatible with our everyday linguistic, conscious forms of limited understanding. In other words, conscious subjectivity arises from a world, it falls into this world, and yet it arises on the condition of being radically incompatible to the basic conditions for this same world. Subjectivity is the limited perspective that the world creates, that obfuscates the truth in which this subjectivity, this consciousness, would emerge. There is a benefit to this move in continental philosophy. It, for example, in the most straightforward sense, separates itself from the, put simply, immediately available forms of analytic truth. Truths which are all too easily derived from the accuracy or inaccuracy with which we try to speak of truth. For example, in analytic philosophy, I defend the term analytic philosophy, even though analytic philosophers dislike it, much like colonizers dislike being called colonizers. For example, in analytic philosophy, correspondence or coherence theories of truth are statements on the factual accuracy of propositions on the basic mechanisms of factual accuracy, the factual accuracy of a proposition, with no, and I insist on this, no fundamental implication for understanding the conditions in which such propositions, the possibility of such propositions might arise, and more fundamentally, with no implication for the structure of political, of artistic, of simply fundamental world regimes. I mean, imagine, it's a very easy example. Can you imagine trying to attempt to explain the logic of a misrecognized, obscured, imperfect truth in a kind of in the transgressive dimension, the miserable dimension of love in a 19th century naturalist novel? Can you imagine trying to account for the fundamental constitutive tensions of 20th century modernization, economic modernization, political modernization, that had this strange double move? It made simply as an example, it made the liberatory potential of something like Bolshevism immediately reverse itself into its own terrifying and persecutory double. Can you imagine accounting for things like this, these aesthetic, political enigmas, by the correspondence value or the coherence value of any proposition about realism, about love, about communism? So, the thing which the continental tradition, at least the one I'm describing and the one I will shortly nonetheless oppose, the thing that it does account for is the negative moment in events such as love, in events such as political ruptures. It accounts for the things in these events in which the crucial aspect of the situation, the fundamentally important kernel of the situation, is the very thing which we are inevitably incapable of articulating about that situation. It is this negative moment that analytic theories are not interested in. So, in other words, as Schelling puts it in his first draft of The Ages of the World, and he abandons this framework in the second and third draft, but any description, any isolated statement on a complex system, a system in any possible logical, metaphysical, political sense, any isolated descriptive statement on a complex system is necessarily a false statement on that complex system. We cannot render the truth of a system by any proposition that emerges from within that system. So anyway, to put it more simply, from Hegel to Badiou and even later, there is no complete statement on truth that is possible. We can find no self-contained proposition on truth. Truth in its ontological register, being tied to being on some level, is barred from the comforting, neat aspects of a kind of continuous or a discursive expression of this truth. Truth, in other words, is that which is occluded. And here is why I argue that the continental tradition, the standard mainstream continental tradition, relies on what I call an occlusionist theory of truth. And that's for lack of a better word. If anyone can find something better, then feel free. But I call it an occlusionist theory of truth, that truth is inevitably occluded, imperfectly expressed. There are, of course, various variations on this. For Heidegger, it seems at first that being is immanent to the world. And this is true. Any faithful account of the structure of the world, or the worldliness in which Dasein, being there, is always already disseminated. This worldliness account, this account of Dasein in its thrownness into the world, relies on the image, the endlessly closed image of an ontological formation of being that is disclosed within an imperfect, irregular, temporary set of ontic relations, as he calls them. In other words, whilst being is always there, there is no being that is not there, Dasein. Whilst being is always there, coexisting with a certain otherness, a very impersonal otherness, the otherness that is always already there, is constituted of Dasein. Whilst being is always there, its there-ness, or its Mitsein, its being with, relies on an ontic, a real-world structure that is enabled to incorporate the ontological unity or primacy of being as such. Heidegger speaks of being insofar as being is the thing that is incompatible to the ontic thrownness of the other-oriented world in which Dasein is always already posited. Heidegger's precursor, Husserl, who Heidegger nonetheless rejects, performs a more extreme cut in this version of truth. What Husserl calls noesis, the intellection, the perceptual frame we apply to an object or to the world. In other words, or more specifically, an endless, indefinite form of, or multiplicity of perspectives on an object creates a strange infinite regress. What he calls the noematic, the opposite to the noesis, the noematic essence of the object, which is deduced from his bracketing operation, from his transcendental Cartesian operation. The noematic essence of the object is simply the failure of any noesis to form a total picture of the object. The more perspectives we take on an object, on the world, the more our indefinitely multiplied perspectives are marked by the stain of a failed perspective of the thing inherent to the object that that rejects any possible perspective. With Badiou we get, I would argue, with all due respect to Badiou, that we get the sharpest version of the occlusionist account of truth. For Badiou, truth is bound to the inconsistent multiplicity of being, the mathematical ontology of being, which underlies, which is adjacent or subjacent to, as he puts it, to the logical relations which structure our world, which structure the possibility of objects and their relations and their modes of appearance, their modes of disappearance. The world, for example, of a scientific framework is conditioned by the mathematical ontology that is in excess of itself. To borrow a phrase from Bergson, the qualitative multiplicity that is in excess not only of the world that it is occluded from, but in excess of itself. And therefore the truth of being is constitutively barred from any situation in which such a truth might emerge, in other words, in which an event might glimpse a certain ontological truth. Any radical event, whether it is a political revolution, whether it's the self-alienating act of falling in love, where your perplexed gaze is directed not only to this other that you are now objectified in relation to, but where your gaze is directed in an alienated way even towards yourself. Any radical event works because we can never truly or completely express what took place for Badiou. No complete logical proposition captures the rupture of an event, in other words, the multiplicity of being, the condition of worlds that emerge as a part of that world. Truth does exist for Badiou, of course, but only by its incomplete expression. Only because the condition of a world, of a logical structure, the unity that precedes it, appears as a paradoxical part of this world itself. So in other words, where truth exists by its incomplete expression, or by the incompatibility, more fundamentally exists by the incompatibility between the ontology of the event and the logic of worlds, or the logics of worlds in which this event emerges, and yet which the ontology underlying the event can never be fully articulated. Then we get to the last figure here, Žižek, who is a more awkward case. As anyone who's read his more mature works, you'll know that Žižek translates a certain ontological incompleteness, as he calls it, into a failure of our epistemological or propositional accounts of the world, of systems. In other words, the ontological incompleteness of the condition of the world means that any proposition on the world will always be inherently incomplete, not because we haven't assumed the right epistemological position, but because of the truth of our epistemological position, the truth of our incomplete epistemological position, simply being a direct mirror to the ontological incompleteness of the fundamental reality that we are trying to understand. So, at first, it does seem that Žižek is not simply suggesting that truth is too much for us, that we can't handle the truth, but rather that truth is lacking, that the being constitutive of truth is simply lacking and incomplete. There are 2 points here, and I won't go into much into this, but first of all, it's worth recognizing that this implies a very convenient symmetry between the epistemological and the ontological. In other words, it implies a symmetry between what can be known and what is, in which both equally at a certain point reflect their mutual incompleteness. In other words, where there is a hopeless exchange of lack between being and the world. The other point is, despite Žižek's more mature turn to Hegel, even in his later works, he remains a Lacanian. And the Lacanian separation that Žižek is trying to express is the familiar separation between the symbolic and the real. And this is a separation, I argue, which most closely relies on a certain occlusionist, for lack of a better word, account of the truth. In other words, where we simply lack the required language, the required symbolic coordinates to express the truth, the axiomatic truth of the real. Because, let's not forget, unlike a figure like Laplanche, the Lacanian methodology is to locate a certain positive, substantial aspect to the real. It is not simply the empty point of an enigmatic message or an enigmatic signifier. At the same time, it can't simply be expressed in the symbolic. Lacan spends several seminars and several essays trying to deduce the formal mathematics, the formal mathematical operations through which we can glimpse the incompatibility of the real to anything we might coherently articulate about it. So the mathings are the formal contradictions of the real, which express a certain truth about the symbolic, about language, about law, about the other. Now, the symbolic is not homogeneous. The symbolic functions by contradicting itself, and yet the real which it touches on in this moment might presuppose the symbolic. The discontinuity of the real might presuppose the symbolic, and yet it forms its own separate regime, its own separate register of formal axiomatic conditions of relation. The real truth of the symbolic, in other words, is only imperfectly and incompletely glimpsed. I will mention Hegel as well. I would say, despite Badiou's fidelity to Hegel, despite Žižek's fidelity to Hegel, that the Hegelian framework is nonetheless the more sophisticated one. The concept, the Begriff for Hegel, is the ultimate culmination of philosophy. This is from the logic, it's the culmination of philosophy. A moment of self-reflexive unification between appearance and essence that retroactively furnishes the preconditions, the presuppositions for its own development. The concept is the totality of philosophy, where philosophy is inseparable from the life that creates philosophy. From the logical syllogisms, the old Greek syllogisms, which are dynamically uncontainable movements that are nested within the static propositions of philosophy. The whole, the universality of the concept, is indirectly mediated by its determinate moments. If anyone's read even a little bit of Hegel, it's clear that you can't remain in the register of abstract universality. The abstract, the universal, requires a moment of positing itself as a moment of itself, of appearing as the indirect, incomplete expression of its own ontological unity. So, the universal, the wholeness of the concept, is mediated by the ruptures, the inconsistencies in which it expresses itself as a particular determinate moment. And yet it does so by separating itself from its own determinations. In other words, in simpler terms, the whole expresses itself as a particular, and yet it reconstructs itself in the very moment that it expresses itself as a determinate, concrete particular. The whole requires its particular form, and yet it can never be its particular form. This is the kind of epistemological historiography of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. In this way, for Hegel, truth does certainly exist. He's not a relativist, despite accepting a certain, not historiography, but conceptual abstracted development or epistemological moments. Truth exists, but its very expression reformulates this same truth. In its very moment of particular concrete expression, this truth is no longer what is glimpsed in its concrete instance. Of course, there's a slightly different version of this. I mean, this is what I mean by the general occlusionist account. There's, of course, a slightly different version of this, which I haven't mentioned, which is inherent to figures like Marx, like Baudrillard, like Lyotard, like Foucault. In a certain broad sweep, and I defend it once again, truth for these figures in this slightly different but tangential account, truth is ideologically structured. In these accounts, there is no second dimension, there is no second register to truth. Truth doesn't occupy a separate, derivative, or incompatible ontological regime. It is rather the empty distortion, the illusion, the illusion of a beyond, internal to our discursive, institutional, politicized, mediatized regimes. In other words, the separate register is itself an illusion implemented by our ideological functions, yes.
Would that be like the early Žižek of the sublime object and things like that?
I would argue that there is the truth, no. I would argue that he is faithful to a non-elusive account of the real, of something that is forever incompatible and separated from our institutionalized economic capitalist modes of spectacular media-style expression. Ideology is always there, even in its neutral accounts, but Žižek is a Lacanian.
So
there is a real exception to our ideological regimes.
So this is other truth that is mediated and like has a privileged position for him.
Yeah,
Okay.
and whereas in more fundamentally Foucault, Baudrillard, Lyotard, a version of Marx very much insists that the stable image of a real, of a truth, of a multiplicity, of a negativity is the illusion generated by an ideological system that posits its own outside. As Sartre puts it, ideology furnishes or stages its very non-ideological point. It stages its own outside. And this is why you claim, when you claim to be non-ideological, to be politically neutral, you are deeply implemented within a certain political structure. Ideology, there is no outside for them to ideology. They stage the impression or the implication of their own outside. Foucault, I will argue, is the most open embodiment, the most direct embodiment of this ideological description of truth. Truth and knowledge are for Foucault outcomes of discursive power relations, discursive relations that furnish their own epistemes, the presuppositions for the very inquiry into truth is conditioned by the discourse, the momentary discourse that asks the question, what is truth? What is truth is not a neutral question, it arises at a certain epistemological, ideological moment in our social relations. So, truth for Foucault is a simply self-critical perspective which recognizes the entanglement of the question of truth with institutional and epistemic priorities and interests, whether they're religious, whether they're economic, whether they're psychopathological. Ironically, and this is a great irony for the rest of my talk, Foucault misdiagnoses, misrepresents this version of truth as the outcome of power relations, as a Nietzschean form of truth. He argues that this is what Nietzsche taught us. My argument is that there is another Nietzsche, a Nietzsche which rejects both versions of truth, both of these occlusionist forms of truth, either where the register of truth operates on a separate, incompatible plane, or where truth is the illusory, temporary manifestation of a mediatized ideological regime that stages its own spectral outside. So let's move to Nietzsche now. That's the opening critical account. of a certain mainstream understanding of the philosophy of truth. In what I would argue is normally Nietzsche's less insightful, less interesting book, Human All Too Human, he nonetheless gives a very paradoxical account of the honest hypocrisy of the actor, of the person who never ceases to act, even in their most dire, tragic, miserable moments, even in those moments which feel most intimate as the most internal expressions of a valid, authentic emotion. In these moments, we get the actor who is the honest hypocrite who acts even to his own registration of his emotions. It's worth reproducing the quote he gives in full. As he puts it in Human All Too Human, "The actor cannot at last refrain, even in moments of the deepest pain, from thinking of the effect produced by his deportment and by his surroundings. For example, even at the funeral of his own child, he will weep at his own sorrow and its manifestations as though he were his own audience. The hypocrite who always plays one and the same part finally ceases to be a hypocrite. As in the case of priests who, when young men, are always either consciously or unconsciously hypocrites and finally become naturally and then really, without affection, mere priests. When anyone, during a long period and persistently, wishes to appear something, it would at last prove difficult for him to be anything else. The calling of almost every man, even of the artist, begins with hypocrisy, with an imitation of deportment, with a copying of the effective in manner. He who always wears the mask of a friendly man must at last gain a power over friendliness of disposition, without which the expression itself of friendliness is not to be gained. And finally, friendliness of disposition gains the ascendancy over him. He is benevolent." In other words, what Nietzsche's portraying is the insincerity of a performative, shallow, inauthentic appearance. This insincerity inevitably furnishes a specific reality of this insincere appearance. The hypocrite who truly embraces the distorted disingenuousness of this hypocrisy thereby makes apparent a certain dimension of abstracted insincerity, which is coupled with or morphs into the truth of this insincerity. He doesn't maintain a naive distinction between his authentic and inauthentic expressions. The true act of self-deception is to assume that a simple distinction can be drawn between the authentic person and the actor. This difference between authenticity and inauthenticity that was so dear to Heidegger is for Nietzsche a empty trap. In other words, the actor, the Nietzschean actor, internalizes their own audience. In this way, the actor is faithful to the internal, alienated, disingenuous spectacle which is tied to the apparent self-same individuality of emotion. Our emotions are never simply for us, for Nietzsche. They exist only as an appeal to the impression or to the implication of another. Even, and I say this with a grain of salt, even psychological studies, which we should of course always be skeptical of, show that emotions are felt in their most augmented, authentic, permanent way when there is the implied presence of someone else. Without other people, our emotions become stunted, imperfectly expressed. It's the abstraction from oneself, the mask one wears or that one adopts in relation to oneself, by becoming one's own audience, that our emotions at least have the semblance of an authentic continuity. So, the Nietzschean actor is faithful to his untruthful gesture of truth by making himself his own spectator. Unlike Sartre's notion of bad faith, Nietzsche's actor represents a paradoxical form of good faith hypocrisy, where there is an honesty that is recognized to the self-alienated, self-othering performance, or where we identify with our difference itself. Bad faith, Sartrean bad faith, which is often misunderstood, misquoted, is really fundamentally a false metaphysical position, where we, in bad faith, attempt to fully identify with who we are, to employ a certain self-identity, a unity which is barred by the internal difference or disparity of the conscious subject. Bad faith is in this sense a misdiagnosis of truth, an attempt to cover up the fundamental constitutive discrepancy, the movement of inauthentic incompatibility in which the structures of self-conscious reality emerge, in which the being for itself, l'être pour soi, emerges. So, to better understand this, I think it's worth turning to Sartre's phenomenological ontology, specifically l'être le néant, being in nothingness, before his critique of dialectical reason, which is a direct reply of a rejection of Hegel, of Husserl, of Heidegger. So by looking at his phenomenological ontology, we can begin to slowly relocate the internal opposition active within truth. Not the opposition to truth, but the opposition active within truth. There's specifically a certain truth that is unpleasantly bound, uncomfortably bound, to a subject that is constitutively incompatible to itself. The important, I won't go through the whole being and nothingness, don't worry, but the important category here is Sartre's idea of nothingness, or néant. Nothingness is, very straightforwardly, not a feature of everyday objects. It's a feature of conscious, self-conscious being. I mean, being for Sartre is always immediately consciousness for Sartre is always immediately self-consciousness. Where an object such as a table, whatever nonsensical phenomenal objects you can think of is for Sartre self-identical. The being of consciousness, as he puts it, is a being which puts its own being into question. Consciousness implies a certain spontaneous, incalculable, and even ineradicable difference and distance between being and itself. A moment of non-coincidence where the being that exists for itself, which necessarily questions itself, is no longer immediately identical to its own being. And yet, we can't formulate this gap between being and itself. There is no positive instance in which this gap can be located as an object for our reflection. The gap between being and itself, between a conscious being and a conscious being for which its own being is always put into question, this gap is immaterial, and we can't simply present to ourselves what it is that divorces subjectivity from itself in the moment of its emergence. In other words, and more fundamentally, the gap is colored by the ungraspable and alienated position of the other, of a radical alterity that is implemented not only outside, but within the structure of the being for itself. In other words, the thing which necessarily renders conscious being other than itself is something and simultaneously nothing. It's a moment of disjunction of a being that arises by placing itself into question, and yet the very essence of this disjunction is a pure immaterial nothingness. In other words, the Sartrean truth of conscious being is that this being cannot account for itself. It plays a perpetual game of catching up to its own spectral distance from itself. To put more simply, the conscious subject cannot repeat itself. It cannot reproduce itself. Its reflection on itself, in the very moment of this reflection, installs a discrepancy in the very thing that it is. To repeat itself is to dislodge itself from its own consistency. Here we return to Nietzsche, and it is at this point of an impossible repetition, an impossible reproduction, that Nietzsche becomes relevant. For Nietzsche, for his image of the eternal return, fundamentally, repetition is a repetition of something that refuses this very moment of repeating. Nietzsche's eternal return, the great theme of his later books, is not simply, as it's often mischaracterized as, the eternal return for Nietzsche is not some kind of naive pseudo-historiography saying that, everything repeats itself, that our lives are endlessly repeating, that historical periods are endlessly repeating. It's far more paradoxical than this. The vision of the eternal return for Nietzsche is the return of a future that has not yet occurred. It's the reproduction of something that has not yet been produced. A return of something, a repetition of something that has yet to come into existence. In other words, Nietzsche's great fundamental anomaly is that the development of European philosophy, the European philosophy that he endlessly criticizes, the development of European philosophy, of European morality, points towards a certain future. It points towards a teleological moment of completion. And yet it is an indefinitely and impossibly postponed future which is repeated endlessly in European philosophical teleology. So in other words, Nietzsche presents a very uncomfortable postponement. This is not the eternal return is not a postponement of truth, but a postponement that is constitutive of a truth that is incompatible to and glimpsed by our European genealogy. In the broader Nietzschean framework, the truth of our moral systems, of a historicized, self-opposing set of moral systems, the master system of morality and the slave system of morality, is coupled, the truth of these systems is coupled with the genealogical rearrangement of these very systems. What he calls the noontide is the uncanny dawn of the Übermensch, and it's an ever postponed and indefinitely unassimilated culmination of the development of European religious and philosophical nihilism, the nihilism of Platonic philosophy, the nihilism of idealism, the nihilism of Buddhism, and the nihilism of Christianity. This noontide, this new man that will emerge, is the inseparable from the postponement that lies as the repeated but unachieved future of European philosophy, and in which the very framework of our philosophical discourse can only ever be corrupted by its own deployment. So this truth, this Nietzschean great truth, the noontide, the eventual transvaluation of values, where the values will be spontaneously reconstructed to account for their own false nihilistic development. This truth that can only be awaited is a truth which is nonetheless short-circuited. It's a truth which acts as its own faulty, erratic, incompatible manifestation. The violent moment, as Nietzsche puts it in his great book, in one of his best books, even though it's overrated for the wrong reasons, as he puts it in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is where madness and truth will coincide. The truth of our genealogy is the truth that is distorted by madness. But it's not a truth that is simply externally distorted by madness. It is where truth is its own unstable, mad distortion. Now this little moment of a truth that is indefinitely postponed, a non-existent truth that in the very emptiness of its non-existent is distortedly repeated and eternally reproduced. This is, for anyone who's read perhaps his most famous book, Beyond Good and Evil, this is his agreement with what he calls the philosophers. His agreement with what the philosophers call the idea, whether it's the Platonic idea, the Kantian idea or ideal, or the Hegelian idea. The idea for Nietzsche has been all too easily separated from the sensual, from the material, from the distorted material world. The claim that the philosophers make for Nietzsche, the philosophers before Nietzsche arises, is a naive claim that the sensual and the transcendent image of the idea and its sensual corruption emerge from two perfectly neatly distinct registers. The more uncomfortable fact, Nietzsche insists, is that the idea cannot be disentangled from its materialized, perverse disturbance. We cannot derive a pure idea because the idea is inherently self-obscuring. It presupposes its inconsistent, genealogically nihilistic articulation. So, where Nietzsche is concerned, very simply, there is no straightforward or faithful discourse on truth. Not because truth is in a different register, not because truth is the spectral illusion of a self-critical, implicitly self-collapsing media system or ideological regime. There is no faithful discourse on truth, since the truth inherently presupposes its irregular self-transgression as a moment within its current aesthetic and ethical coordinates. The truth requires and demands these faulty, perverse European genealogical coordinates, which this truth is nonetheless opposed to. So the truth is not simply genealogical. It's not a power-driven set of institutionalized interest in the Foucauldian sense. In a more fundamental level, the truth is internally entangled with its own alterity, with the very thing that it rejects. The truth demands our distorted metaphysical historicism, whilst being the very thing that this historicism perpetually fails to account for. Ultimately then, for Nietzsche, there is no self-consistent truth that is occluded by our current European philosophical framework, but rather that the very mechanism of truth is bound to a necessary disorientation and postponement. If in the traditional continental account, the truth, or experience of truth, or glimpsed incomplete experience of truth, points to a certain ontological register that is separated from and misrecognized in our everyday situation, then the Nietzschean alteration is that we must recognize the problem that truth always demands this misrecognition as its internal principle. Truth, in Nietzsche's critical rereading of our European heritage, is indistinguishable from its corrupted and imperfect articulation. So this is our Nietzschean task. Not how to discern a pure truth, a pure idea, truth without madness, but rather to be faithful to a truth which postpones itself in its own material instance, a truth that is caught up with its own internal self-rejection. So that's Nietzsche and Sartre. Now we'll get to the final figure, Deleuze. Badiou, who I've mentioned, Alain Badiou, characterizes Deleuze as a failed philosopher of the event, a failed philosopher of multiplicity, a philosopher of the qualitative inarticulability of the event that nonetheless accidentally succumbs to the Platonic one. Deleuze, for Badiou, is a philosopher who cannot express the transgressive dimension of being in truth. There is, of course, a value, something to defend in Badiou's intervention here. But the premise of his rejection of Deleuze is not entirely justified. Deleuze was never a thinker of the event, and he wasn't exactly a thinker of multiplicity either. He was something more paradoxical. Instead, I argue that Deleuze's legacy can be described as the progressive effacement of the event, the undoing of the very philosophical notion of an event. It's the collapse of the separation between truth and world that upholds the very possibility of the event. In other words, Deleuze and his legacy is the thing we must confront after the event. Deleuze is the event that emerges when we can no longer think a philosophical event. So, Deleuze's first relevant treatment of the event comes 1 year after the breakthrough of difference and repetition, with Logic of Sense in 1969. In this book, Deleuze frames the event. He speaks of an event as the possibility of truth. He frames it as the outcome of a series of logical relations. Series which indirectly, paradoxically, momentarily relate or do not relate to each other by enigmatic conjunctions, spontaneous inconsistencies between two separated logical series that suddenly touch and inexplicably produce the spectral image of sense, of stable reference points, for example, in our experience of time, in our experience of literature. These logical conjunction between series is where the image of a possibility of sense emerges. The important point for Deleuze, nevertheless, is that the event does not precede its effects. It's not simply retroactively posited either, but it cannot be disentangled from the immediately divergent tendencies of these logical series if they do touch. Instead, the relationships established between the logical relations of specific systems of series, whether it's time, whether it's literature, whether it's paradox as such. These relations between logical relations of the world are primary. It's the relations that precede and effectuate the image of a parallel virtual causality, only as a secondary hypothetical point of origin. There is an interesting affinity here between Deleuze, one of the philosophers most rejected by modern science, an interesting affinity here between Deleuze and the physicist Roger Penrose, and Penrose's theoretical opposition both to string theory and to the Copenhagen interpretation that reality essentially has some problematic feature. Penrose was a notorious skeptic, and he still is a notorious skeptic, of the inevitable, uncontainable infinities, as they're called, incalculable negative points that arise with our string theory speculations, whether it's the Maldacena conjectures, whether it's attempt to account for open closed loops, for branes against which loops connect, etc. These calculations produce infinities, and in order to account for the infinities, you need an indefinite number of new additional dimensions. He was skeptical of these endlessly supplemented dimensions that might momentarily account for the infinities or the incalculable moments of string theory. He also, as Penrose puts it, our problem is we haven't accounted for the collapse of the wave function, and to account for it either by consciousness or by infinities doesn't make sense. As Lee Smolin, one of the great historians of modern physics, of the way string theory emerged, puts it in the way he describes Penrose's alternate avenue for modern physics. And I'll once again give you the full citation, where Lee Smolin describes the basic dynamics of Roger Penrose's alternative, what's called twistor theory. Traditionally, one sees what happens as primary, and the relationships between what happens as secondary. This was the traditional view, both in string theory and those skeptical of string theory. Thus, the events are real, and causal relationships between the events are simply properties of the events. Penrose found that this way of looking at things can be reversed. You can take the elementary causal processes as fundamental and then define events in terms of coincidences between causal processes. More specifically, you can make a new space consisting of all the light rays in space-time. Fundamentally, the relations established between events, between series of events, are what produce the origin of these series. So Penrose reverses the accepted cause-effect relationship of modern physics. The events which would supposedly trigger a set of fundamental relationships is reduced to a byproduct, a virtual secondary displaced byproduct of these very relations. There is, in other words, no stable and independent ontological event which acts as the ground of physical interactions, but an unstable relation between interactions as such, which do not chronologically follow from a distorted a priori event. Ironically, the same is the case for Deleuze, for the Deleuze specifically of logic of sets, the Deleuze of 1969. Whatever truth there is to the event, it is a truth which rejects any semblance of its own primacy. We cannot understand the sense of logical series without coupling the sense, the sense underlying logical series, with an internally self-rejective, incompatible moment, whereby the event is the product of these conjunctions. It is not what causes these fundamental relations, it is what is secondarily necessitated by these conjunctions. Now, by the time much later, 11 years later, of the publication of A Thousand Plateaus, Mille Plateaux, which I would argue is Deleuze and Guattari's correction of all of the eccentric errors of the earlier anti-Oedipus. By Mille Plateaux, the event is replaced by a perpetual and imperceptible becoming. There is no static, terminal, definable moment even of the event, whether it's truthful or untruthful. And there is only the imperceptible postponed becoming. There are no definitive ruptures. There are no oppositions between being and the world. Instead, there is only the progressive and uncanny unraveling of the structures of the world, of desiring, of capitalist stratifications, of regimes of expression, of despotic or authoritarian codes, which become unrecognizable to themselves. Becoming animal, for example, in the Deleuzian Guattarian sense, doesn't simply mean returning to nature. It's not a cheap Buddhist naivety. It means more fundamentally embodying the inexpressible disturbance nested within the most familiar forms of expression that we have. It is not becoming animal, is not the natural state that precedes civilization, but the transgressive entropy of civilization that we meet in the most intimate point of civilization and at the other end of civilization. In other words, the truth of our social regimes is that they furnish a qualitatively new and unrecognizable anti-regime entropy and inconsistency within these regimes produced by these apparent regimes. So becoming animal isn't a return, it is becoming imperceptible, it is doubling the regime in relation to itself. More fundamentally, it is not just, as Deleuze and Guattari and their readers like to put it, that oppositional movements, political oppositional movements, aesthetic oppositional movements, even personal forms of individualized resistance. It's not just that such oppositional movements are flights from signifying structures, from despotic, authoritarian regimes. It's not simply that these are flights that are unrecognizable to the structures they oppose, but rather that these flights, the very moment of flight from the face, from stratification, is unrecognizable to itself. It doesn't know where it is going. The flight has no preconceived notion even of itself, and even less of the thing it's opposing. So the line of flight is a flight away not only from the regime but from itself. So becoming animal or becoming imperceptible is at its core not a defined opposition but rather the experimental self-dissemination in which truth cannot predict its own development. So this is how Deleuze renders the classical philosophical use, even the Greek philosophical use of hexaetes, of abstracted, unexchangeable intensities, rejecting any quantification, any making equivalent, and which imply a functional incompatibility to the very system which would internally formulate these intensities. Their intensities for the very reason that their intensity means that they are incalculable even to their own coordinates. So, and we're reaching the end here. What is the common point between Sartre and Nietzsche and Deleuze? If these three philosophers might have met, their disagreements would be far more emphasized, as I'm sure isn't a controversial statement, their disagreements would be far more emphasized than their possible agreement. My argument, however, is that these three figures represent an alternative genealogy of truth, an alternative account of truth, a version of truth that doesn't fit with the analytic forms of correspondence and coherence, but doesn't fit with the occlusionist version of Hegel, of Husserl, of Heidegger, of Badiou, of Žižek, and also doesn't fit with the ideologized, historicist, materialist accounts of ideologized truth. In the continental mainstream that I described earlier, we are unable to handle the truth, as Jack Nicholson said. Truth is occluded from our everyday framework. With Sartre and Nietzsche and Deleuze, however, we get an anti-occlusionist truth. Not the straightforward truth of analytic philosophy, but a truth, to twist Jack Nicholson's phrase, a truth not that we can't handle, but a truth that can't handle itself. A truth which necessitates its own rejection. So, there's an obvious point here. Why does this matter? And I would argue it has a very immediate relevance. A relevance that we're seeing very soon, in a few weeks, with our soon-to-be, at least in the UK, with our soon-to-be Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, who in his opposition to Keir Starmer made an unintentionally ontologically critical point. As he opportunistically declared, politics isn't working. Now obviously, it's not controversial to probably say that this was some modest opposition to the cracks within the UK's two-party system. Keir Starmer's Labour leadership has lost the trust of most of the British population, and the Tory opposition under Kemi Badenoch has been mostly rendered completely ineffective and irrelevant. At the same time, Rupert Lowe, Tommy Robinson, Nigel Farage are mobilising a far-right opposition to the current establishment, which is not only, and I'm not afraid to say this, the real fear isn't that they're racist, the fear is that they have no serious political project. They're a totally ineffective opposition. At the same time, Andy Burnham's comment that politics isn't working has a further reaching echo. The current neoliberal establishment, even with its predicted since the Frankfurt School, its interludes of nationalist right-wing deviations, is unable to deal with the real crises of a global capitalist alliance, which not only fuels climate destruction, threats of nuclear fallout, ethnic warfare, endlessly, increasingly aggressive and sharp forms of economic exploitation, but a global capitalist alliance that seems unable to even deal with its own systems of communication, that's endlessly reshifting itself, reshifting the implications of military power, of strategic political alliance, etc. However, there's a slight problem with Andy Burnham's comment. Maybe it's a problem he's aware of, who knows. But if we admit that politics isn't working, there is a corollary question. Is there any actual politics that really works? We are obviously, and I'm not a reactionary, we are obviously right to be frustrated by the current disorientation of global financial systems and their subservience to a billionaire elite, to a capricious and unpredictable billionaire elite. At the same time, and if there's one lesson we should remember from Mark Fisher, it's the very clear one, not only are there no alternatives, but capitalism already seems to occupy its own alternative. It seems to be present both in what it is and what it is not. Whether it is the false solution of sustainable consumerism or disaster planning, capitalism readily thrives in the image of its own contradiction. It thrives and grows and becomes even more aggressive in the image of its own collapse. Instead, we should maybe be faithful to the old, nice French anthropological arguments that the politics of civilization are inherently and constitutively disappointing. They enforce a social contract which submits us to the overarching priorities of an ethically and other-oriented, but nonetheless alienating, cultural logic. True politics is therefore incompatible with the necessarily repressive logic of politics as such. Rather than eliminating the compromises, the apparent external compromises, alienations of politics, we need a politics that can account for the inevitability of a compromised distortion in itself. Equality in the political sense does not mean that we can all do whatever we want. It doesn't mean that repression is lifted. It means that we are bound to the same standards and economic treatments. So the anti-occlusionist version of truth, the version of truth I modestly present with Sartre, with Nietzsche, and with Deleuze, is in this case not about finding a true politics behind our current failures, a nice homogeneous true politics behind apparent external contingent forms of distortion, but about discerning a political framework for the distortion inherent to truth. It is about recognizing a failure or distortion deployed by truth itself. In other words, a politics of a inverse negative Jack Nicholson, where it's not the case that you can't handle the truth, but that the truth can't handle itself. Thank you very much. That's the end. And questions?
One question about Deleuze's imperceptibility. Deleuze is, I would say, an anti-Hegelian. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, he tries to be.
Yes, but I found that Hegel's notion that perfection, the perfect sort of harmony between form and content entails entropy, might have some affinities with this Deleuzean notion that the truth sort of obscures itself in the end. Is that?
I mean, it's a point, but there is the harmony between form and content for Hegel is undone at every moment. You can discern a form.
Mm-hmm.
A form.
Yeah.
Deleuze actually has a chapter of this on this in Mille Plateaux on form and content and on variations on expression. And he does essentially, in a similar way that Heidegger tries to do without ever really explaining it, account for the fact that the indefinite rearrangement of form and content that Hegel does account for, but a certain truthfulness that would account for its rearrangement can always be accounted for by a new modality of expression in the Deleuzean sense. In other words, that there are that expression isn't opposed to the specific conditions under which it's expressed, but that expression is transgressive to itself.
Okay.
So more simply, that there isn't a conceptual development. I mean, even Hegel's aesthetic abides by the logic, and the Deleuzean point would be that there is no such overarching deployment of a certain movement that would create this tension between form and expression.
I suspected as much. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic talk. You said that in Deleuze, well, Badiou's one of major arguments against Deleuze was the idea that he claims to be a non-philosopher of the event, this post-evental philosopher. But I'm just thinking now about the truth process in Badiou and how the process of truth creation, for example, the arithmetic deduction of infinite prime numbers, for example, to an extent requires the stability of a subject in order to perpetuate the reality of the truth, so to speak, through it. I would say that, and I wonder if you agree, maybe Badiou is more Deleuzean than he thinks of himself to be, because the requirement of a perpetuating subject is in fact sort of a post-evental, after the event kind of perpetuation. The naming of the event, and for Badiou, and then its subsequent fidelity to this flash of an event that is only retroactively constitutable, I would argue in some sense, and I wonder if you agree, very much this idea that the event is not really an event as such in Badiou.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. I mean, first of all, it's to be specific. What Badiou accuses Deleuze of is not being a thinker after the event, but being unable to think of events and multiplicities. He accuses him of being a thinker of the one, specifically because Deleuze doesn't have a language for qualitative multiplicities, which Badiou does, set theory. Deleuze doesn't have this type of language, and this is why he essentially says that if you pursue the development of Deleuzean quality, hexaeties, multiplicities, you find the imprint of the Platonic one. But yes, I mean, the question of the sign. Deleuze rejects subject. It's a empty, despotic, temporary imprint of some forced coding of the body without organs, of the plane of consistency. I mean, one of the important points is that for Badiou, his mathematical ontology, the multiple is in excess of itself. This is the case for Deleuze. It's pure continuity. It's a plane of consistency. It's pure homogeneity. There is no stratification. There is no heterogeneity for Deleuze, and therefore there is no subject after this is glimpsed. Badiou's subject is, you're right, always, as he puts very, very clearly in his famous Mathème for it, always the subject of a trace of a truth that is inexpressed. There is, again, a subject of the similarity. My argument would be that the subject doesn't know what it doesn't entirely know what it's faithful to. That it doesn't entirely realize the ontological substrate of pure axiomatic multiplicities that it is faithful to in the rupture of an event. It simply takes a leap of faith in the Kierkegaardian sense and hopes that some truth, some futurely anticipated truth will emerge from it. But there is even this nice, neat categorization isn't there for Deleuze. There's no ontological register glimpsed in the line of flight, for example. This is the line of flight. It's not deterritorialization, and it's not Anti-Oedipus. The line of flight is something different. It's a mode of variation on the plane of consistency, and therefore the very subject, the Badiouian subject, recognizes itself in its fidelity to an unknown. The Deleuzian line of flight cannot recognize itself. It becomes imperceptible. It becomes animal, for the very reason that it is unrecognizable to itself. So there is even the neat categorization of subject is faithful to the trace of an inarticulable event. These three specific modalities and these two register of the logical world in which a subject operates and the ontological regime that it attempts to be faithful to, that separation doesn't take place. What you have is a perpetual kind of uncanny unrecognizability of flight from itself. But it's a very, very valid point. Any violent oppositions? No?
Any recommendations for books on physics and philosophy?
I think, well, ironically, reading the early Copenhagen interpretation people is the most exciting. Reading Werner Heisenberg, Niels Bohr is exciting. And reading the people who have been deep within string theory and then left are always fun. But yeah, Werner Heisenberg, anything he's written, Niels Bohr. Reading Sartre, I mean, especially some of the journals on, because even in some physics journals, the question of quantum indeterminacy and contradiction are emerging on a metaphysical level, and those are worth looking at. But yeah, all of those figures.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all very much.